What's up, guys? Welcome to this episode of Texas Redfish Hunter TV. Today I'm going to be taking you guys through a Q&A. It's a question and answer session where I'm answering questions asked by you guys over the past 3 weeks. And I got a lot of really good questions, and I've got a couple main ones that I really want to get to, and also some questions that I get a lot on the channel that I'm going to answer as well. It all started with a previous video that I did on tips for beginners and my tips for kayakers getting started in the kayak fishing game. That was actually a question asked by Blaine. So if you haven't seen that video, go check that out after this video, and you can learn about tips that I have for beginners in kayak fishing. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk about is the first question that I think is a big question that's going to help you guys out a lot. And that is a question asked by Jim West and Backcountry Fishing Rods. Now, this question was, what are the seasonal movements of these redfish? What types of locations, depths, water conditions for redfish throughout the entire year, and what is the best month of the year for finding redfish? So that's a great question, and these redfish are very, they can be predictable at times, and knowing where they are and where they should be and where they are definitely will help you when you're on the water. So what I want to start with is, I guess, seasonal movements. There really isn't much for seasonal movements of redfish. There's the big, obviously, bull red run that runs from about mid-September to mid-November. It peaks at about in October. So mid-October to late October to early November is when I do most of my bull red fishing. So what they do is this is their breeding run. These are when the big bull reds are running from the shallows in the bays out to the deep water for basically their breeding migration. And they're going to be running through the channels, across the guts in the Gulf, and pretty much every inlet, outlet from the bay to the Gulf of Mexico along the Texas coast is going to be holding these bull redfish. And it's definitely an easy time to go out and catch these bull redfish. I also have a video on my channel. I'll put a link here, a card that you guys can check out my tips for bull red fishing from shore. And you can also check out a video of Cora and I catching a bunch of bull redfish this year, and you could learn a lot about how to go out and catch these bull redfish during this bull redfish one, which is again from about mid-September to mid-November, peaking in October. And I guess that brings me to my the next question, which was, what's the best month for catching redfish? To me, I really like the bull red run in October, so I'm gonna say October. But there's another good time, and that's the summer. So May, June even is a really good time for going out and catching the redfish in the marsh on your kayaks. That's a really good time of year to be there. So that brings us into more seasonal. Summertime redfish are definitely out in abundance, and I'm going to get into that right now. So the next thing I want to talk about is that it's not necessarily a seasonal movement of redfish, because they're going to stick in the marshes in the bay system year-round. They're going to be there, they're going to be able to be found, but they do different things depending on conditions that are experienced. The biggest condition that affects redfish is tidal movement. You want tidal movement when it comes to catching these redfish. So what the redfish tend to do is they sit and they're ambush predators. So they're going to sit off of current movements. So this is like marsh drains, channels, channel cuts, like just where there's a lot of good current movement, and then there's just a place just out of this current movement that doesn't have as much water movement. The redfish will sit on the edges of these pools and the edges of these drains, and they'll wait for bait to come past them. So as soon as a bait that comes into their range gets in front of them, that's when they're going to go and attack and hit. And they hit very aggressively when they're feeding like this, which is mostly how they're feeding. So they're ambush predators. They sit and wait for bait to come to them during these tidal movements, and that can be the most successful time to go out and catch these redfish. So slack tide is not a great time to catch redfish. A lot of times they're not eating on a slack tide. Reason being is they're shifting, they're moving, and they're moving to their new spot that they're going to be for when that tide starts shifting again. So the tide, let's say it's high tide. High tide is a really good time to go out into shallow marsh systems, bay systems, flats. High tide is when they're going to be moving through these flats, feeding pretty aggressively. And it's from the best time is basically from a high tide and then a falling tide. So you'll have the high tide, and then right when it starts to fall, that is when the redfish are going to be feeding at their most active, and they're going to be up shallow in the marshes, in the bays, on the flats. That's going to be a really good place to find redfish on a falling tide. They like, also saying that they don't just like a high tide, they also will eat on a low tide. On a low tide, a lot of the times, especially in like the marsh, they're going to be finding those deeper holes. So when the water drops to its lowest point, they're going to be in the deeper holes off into, like, let's say channels or guts, and off of the banks. High tide, I like fishing up against the banks. Lower tides, I like fishing away from the banks and into that deeper water. That's where they're going to be holding during those low tides. They will run up onto the flats during low tides occasionally, and they'll come back into those deeper holes, but most of them are holding in those deeper holes. And some big schools of redfish can hold in those deeper holes. The marsh and the flats are full of holes. It could go from 2 foot to 4 foot, and that 2 foot drop of a hole, redfish will sit in that hole and wait for bait to come over them when it's coming in. In let's say grass flats, if you're in a grass flat, you're going to see, especially if you're sight fishing, you're going to see a massive amount of grass on the flat itself. And then there's going to be holes of sand, and it looks like just sand bottoms, but it actually tends to sometimes be a little bit deeper water as well. The fish will sit in these sand spots in the grass and wait for bait to come into that sand spot. The best way to catch these fish is to throw, let's say, a soft plastic across the grass, rip it through that hole, and as soon as it comes out of the grass and into that sand area, if there's a redfish there, they're going to pounce on it. So that's definitely another good way of catching these redfish. Again, high tide, you're going to be looking for them in shallows. As the tide's falling, they're going to be feeding up in those shallow areas. Once it gets to its low tide period, they're going to be moving and shifting to deeper waters. And then right when that tide starts moving back in, they're going to be feeding from these deeper holes and then starting to push up on the flats. They'll hold up on the edges of these holes. They'll hold on the edges of channels. And they're going to be feeding in those areas as well. So it all depends on tidal movement where I decide to go to fish. And that's kind of brings me to my next point is, when you're fishing, if you're catching, make sure you write down these conditions that you're catching in. Is it a falling tide? Is it a coming in tide? Where are they? Are they in deep water? Are they in shallow water? What are the conditions that you're fishing? Is it cloudy? Is it sunny? Write these things down so that if these conditions happen again, you can catch these fish again. Because a lot of the times, if they're there one time, if they're doing something very particular at one time and you're catching a ton of fish, they're going to be doing that again. Maybe not in that exact same spot, but in a very similar spot, they're going to be doing something like that as well. So it definitely helps to keep track of when you're catching fish and when you're not, so that you don't make the same mistake twice, or you can repeat past successes. That brings me to the next thing, which is fronts, weather fronts that come in. Redfish like frontals. Like, if you see a front coming in, you should get excited, because the day before the front, and even the day the front hits itself, the redfish are going to be actively feeding. They can sense stuff like that. It has to do with the pressure. So the barometric pressure definitely affects these fish. They can feel that difference in pressure, and it causes them to turn on or turn off. Before a front comes in, they feel that difference in pressure, and it sets them off to feeding. During the front, they'll still feed, but it's the day after the front, when that pressure rises, that they're going to turn off. They're going to get lockjaw. They're not going to want to eat. So you need to watch out for that. Usually the first day after a front's not a great day to go fishing. I mean, you will occasionally catch fish, but it's not as effective. Now the second day after the front, that's the day that you will want to go fishing, because most of the time they haven't eaten much the day before, and the pressure kind of equalizes, and then they're ready to set off and feed again. And they can feed very aggressively on the second day after a front. So definitely look for your front movements, and then figure out what your tide is, and then you can target where you think these redfish are going to be. So a lot of these things happen all at once, so you've got to weigh the pros and cons. If it's a high tide, they're going to be shallow. If it's the day after a front, they might not be feeding very hard. So it's stuff you've got to weigh, but if you take it all as a whole and you look at the big picture of everything, you should be able to predict where these fish are going to be. Cold fronts also will send redfish into bigger schools. So when a cold front comes in, or when the cold water starts coming in, these fish will school up pretty heavy, and you can find these schools either in high tides on the flats or in low tides in the pools. So that's something else to keep in mind. Now, in saying this, fish will school up year-round. It just depends on the conditions you're in. Again, if you see a school of redfish, write down the conditions you're in and try to figure out why they're schooling. And then that way, if those conditions happen again, you can find these schools again. If you have any further questions on where to find redfish, definitely ask it in the comments below or email me at redhuntertx@gmail.com, and I'll try to give you more of an overview if you're still confused on how to find these redfish depending on the conditions. And that kind of brings me to the point of it's not necessarily a specific spot. A lot of people ask for a specific spot, but what they don't understand is that spot isn't always successful. Every time I go to a certain spot, I'm not catching fish. It doesn't have as much to do with an exact spot as it does to do with the conditions that were experienced at that spot, which is why I don't always tell people exactly where I was. You'll know occasionally where I am. I fish Moses Lake quite a bit. You'll see me there. You'll see me in the Galveston Bay system. You'll see me in Pierce Marsh. You'll see me in these places. It's not necessarily the exact spot that I'm fishing, but it's the conditions that I'm fishing. So don't ask exact spots. Ask, what were the conditions like? I will tell you what the conditions were like when I was fishing. That way, if you see conditions like that, you can try to find a similar spot to what I was fishing. So that's what I want to key in on. Don't ask for specific spots. Ask me for conditions. If I haven't told you in the video itself, I will definitely either leave it in the description or tell you if you ask a comment or email me. So that is a big point that I wanted to bring to y'all. So now I'm going to get into a lot of the smaller questions that I got. Smith Rangel, he asked, what reels do I use? I have a very big variety of reels. I've got a lot of Penn reels. I've got 2 Penn Spinfisher 5s. I've got a Penn Battle 2. I've got bait caster wise, I've got a Shimano Corrado 200. That's a fantastic bait casting reel. And my newest reel is the 13 Fishing Concept C. I love that reel. That reel's fantastic. Next question came from Chris. He said, do topwaters produce in cold water? There was an answer on the YouTube, on the comment in the YouTube section, and that actually was a pretty good answer. Yes, it does produce during cold water movements, especially for redfish. Redfish aren't as susceptible to cold water as trout are. So that's something to also keep in mind. But at the same time, they are a little bit slower. They're not going to be as active in hitting a topwater, obviously, when they're a little bit colder, when the water's a little bit colder. But that isn't to say that they won't hit these topwaters. If they're feeding, they're going to hit these topwaters. A better way to catch the fish a lot of the times in the colder water, if they're not hitting a topwater right away, then I would move to a slow sinking, not even a plastic, a slow sinking hard bait like a mirror lure. Something that's going to mimic a topwater but sit about halfway through the water level. So soft plastics will also work. That's something that you can keep in mind. But I still think that topwaters can produce under the right conditions, even in cold water. You just got to find the right conditions and when they're actively feeding. That way you can find when they're going to hit those topwaters. Next question came from Rolando Romero, who I see a lot of questions from, and he always is commenting, so thank you. I appreciate your support. His question was, any fishing brands that you like in particular? I do have a lot of my apparel's Columbia. I just like the way it feels when I'm fishing. I have a lot of Columbia fishing shirts. I'm wearing a Columbia now. I almost exclusively wear Columbia. That's not to say that I don't wear other stuff, but I really like Columbia just because I think they have really quality products. This stuff will, even on hot days, will keep you fairly cool. That's just me in particular, clothing wise. I tend to wear Columbia. It really doesn't matter what you wear. It just be comfortable. That's all that really matters when you're on the water, is be comfortable. Fishing reel wise, as you heard before, I like Penn reels. I've really never had a problem with Penn reels, and I'm going to do a video later on my exact reels and why I picked these reels and the good parts of these reels, kind of a reel review, along with a rod review. But I'm waiting on a couple new rods. I can't wait to tell you about them because they're fantastic rods, and I will show you those as soon as I get them in because I'm really looking forward to using them. The next question came from Joe Doe. He said, what are basic rigs, pull, line, lures, hooks, stuff that I use? I'm going to do a full video on that somewhere down the line, but the basics of what I use are, if I'm fishing live shrimp, I'm using, bottom rigs, so, Carolina rigs, something like that, weight, leader, hook. Hooks that I use, I tend to use treble hooks when I'm using live shrimp. If I'm using live mullet, definitely like a 3/0 circle hook, something like that. That I use for the live mullet or a live bait hook. Those are the main things that I use. Popping corks work fantastic for redfish, so definitely go with popping corks. Rods, I tend to go medium Medium's just, it's medium. It's fun, but it also gets you the fish most of the time. I'll even go medium light. Medium light makes it a little bit more fun to catch fish. I mean, Cora on that medium light rod, Cora and I caught that massive black drum that you guys saw on the channel, that 45-inch, 50+ pound black drum on a medium light rod. So I think medium light's what I go with on my rods most of the time. The biggest thing that I use for rods is fast action tip. It gives me a little bit more feel. It lets me feel bites easier. It lets me feel bottom structure easier. So that's what I look for in rods. Lures, lures are something that you're going to see me talk about on each video individually. It depends on the conditions. My favorite lure is gulp, 4-inch gulp swimming mullet in chartreuse. I've said that a lot of times. That's my favorite lure. It catches everything. So that's probably my best lure. I get this question all the time, and it's, what is my opinion on sit-in kayaks? And I will tell you right now, I do not like them at all. That's just personal opinion, especially when you're fishing saltwater. You don't need a sit-in kayak. You don't want to sit in kayak because that thing can take on water and can sink you right where you are. They don't do well with turtling. So, sit-in kayaks, I don't like them personally. Not to say that they don't work in a lot of different situations. I know freshwater anglers use them a lot. They're stable, they're good kayaks, don't get me wrong. There can be good sit-in kayaks out there. I personally don't like them. I'll never use one. And just because the sit on top for saltwater purposes and the way that I fish are fantastic and the best way to go. A lot of saltwater, I don't really know of any saltwater anglers who use sit-in kayaks. Sit-in kayaks, I think, are built more for rivers and freshwater. But that's my personal opinion. Again, you guys might hate it, but that's just my personal opinion on that. So actually, I think that's going to be it. I think those are the main questions that I got. If you have any further questions, again, feel free to leave them in the comment section below or email me at redhuntertx@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer all the questions that you guys have. I get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Sometimes I get a little bit busy and I can't respond right away. But definitely keep asking your questions. I will respond to all the questions that I get. Also, like us on Facebook, Texas Redfish Hunter TV. You can ask us questions there as well. You're going to be getting daily updates from Cora and I, and updates. And I'll ask questions. Like for this video, I asked if you wanted to get a fishing video this week or a Q&A this week, and whichever one would be pushed to the next week. As I expected, you guys chose fishing video. So the fishing video went out last week, and I put the Q&A out this week. So stuff like that I will ask on Facebook, and if you want to have a say in what I post on the channel, definitely like us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram, Texas Redfish Hunter TV, for pictures. And I think that's it. I'll leave links at the end of the video for you to subscribe if you haven't already. Check out our other fishing videos of us going out and catching these redfish. Check out our kayak reviews and our tips and tricks. Definitely keep track of the channel, and I appreciate you guys' support. Again, any further questions, ask me. And I will see you guys on the water next week. Later.